Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. My name is Christopher Scalia. I'm a senior fellow here at AEI, and it's my honor to introduce the third installment of our American Dream lecture series. A component of AEI's American Dream initiative, this series seeks to revitalize our nation's core institutions and values by inviting prominent writers, academics, and thinkers to address some of the most significant cultural and social issues facing the United States. As we approach the 250th anniversary of America's founding, these lectures are an opportunity to ask, how healthy are our national institutions and foundational principles? What threats do they face, and what prospects for reform are available? And in the case of today's lecture, what guidance can we gain from great thinkers and writers of the past? In the wide variety and high quality of its featured speakers, the American Dream lectures continue the tradition of AEI's Bradley Lecture Series, which for decades enriched policy conversations with high-profile lectures about the state of American politics and culture. At your table, you'll see flyers listing some of the events we have planned for the months ahead. Please feel free to take one home with you. Valentine's Day is coming up. For the benefit of those watching us on live stream, I'll just say that in April, we'll be welcoming Jonathan Haidt to speak about social media, followed by a conversation with AEI's Christine Rosen. And in May, Ruth Weiss will speak about anti-Semitism, followed by a conversation with AEI's Matthew Continetti. Now, it may seem counterintuitive to feature a discussion about Russian literature in a lecture series about the American Dream, considering that for much of the 20th century, the Soviet Union represented the greatest threat to that dream and to the American way of life. And in the present day, even as support for American aid to Ukraine has dropped in recent months, 2/3 of Americans still see Russia's invasion as a threat to American interests. But here at AEI, we are not going to follow the lead of the arts venues that banned the performance of Russian ballets and compositions. We know that great art has a way of transcending its immediate context and helping us recognize problems we face in the present. We are drawn to great literature in particular because it offers both the familiar and unfamiliar, foreign settings and unique characters, unknown historical events and new personal dilemmas, share pages with compelling depictions of human nature and behavior, of enduring philosophical conundrums and moral dilemmas. Such literature doesn't just depict events, it reveals characters, asks questions, explores ideas. Or as today's speaker writes in his new book, free copies of which are available in the front, quote, "The greatest literature advances understanding not by supplying final answers to eternally open questions, but by revealing new depths in the questions themselves. Wisdom begins with better questions posed more thoughtfully, and literature, if it accomplishes what it should, leaves its readers wiser." If you scour the index of Gary Saul Morson's Wonder Confronts Certainty, Russian Writers on the Timeless Questions and Why Their Answers Matter, you won't find the names Putin or Zelensky, Trump or Biden, nor even, I'm afraid, Swift or Kelsey. But you will find Tolstoy, Chekhov, Dostoevsky, Solzhenitsyn asking, in their art, questions that we're still asking ourselves. For example, what constitutes humanness? What is the role of social theory and of experts? What is the line separating good from evil? And to quote Dr. Morson, are there iron historical laws or just soft tendencies? In his marvelous book, Dr. Morson dives into challenging novels, immerses readers into the context of their creation and the details of their plots and characters in remarkably clear, engaging, and accessible prose. And he shows, most of all, that the questions they ask pertain today, that we still have a lot to learn, as well, it must be said, a lot of pleasure to glean from them. Life is eternal dialogue, he writes, a world symposium that never ends. Literature, especially realist novels and related genres, allows us to sense the spirit of Symposium. Dr. Morson is the Lawrence B. Dumas Professor of the Arts and Humanities and Professor of Slavic Languages and Literature at Northwestern University, where he has taught for nearly 40 years. A member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, he's the author of many books about various topics in Russian literature, including the works of Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, and the literary critic and philosopher Mikhail Bakhtin, as well as books about literary quotations, aphorisms, and the art of the narrative. He's also co-author with Morton Shapiro of Sense, as in dollars and cents, and Sensibility, What Economics Can Learn from the Humanities, and Minds Wide Shut, How the New Fundamentalism Divides Us. His reviews and commentary have been featured in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the New Criterion, the American Scholar, Commentary, and elsewhere. Dr. Morson will deliver opening remarks about the enduring questions explored in Russian literature, after which he'll be joined on stage for a discussion with Dr. Tony Mills. Dr. Mills is a senior fellow here at AEI, where he writes about science and technology policy, the role of government in science, and the relationship between science and democracy. He is also the director of AEI's new Center for Technology, Science, and Energy. He is concurrently a senior fellow at Pepperdine University School of Public Policy and a scholar associate of the Society of Catholic Scientists. He previously worked for numerous publications, and his writings have appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, National Affairs, and various peer-reviewed journals. He holds a PhD and MA in philosophy from the University of Notre Dame, a BA in philosophy, French, and Comp Lit from Northwestern, and he also, most importantly, had the pleasure of, as he puts it, taking every class Dr. Morson offered there. Dr. Mills and Dr. Morson will be in conversation for about 25 minutes, and then we'll open the floor up to audience Q&A for the remainder of the event. And then after the audience Q&A, those doors will open, and we hope you'll be able to join us for light refreshments and deep conversations in the adjoining gallery. But now, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our guest, Dr. Gary Saul Morson, for his remarks on Russian literature and timeless questions.
Thank you so much. That was an absolutely wonderful introduction, and it's a real honor to be here. I never expected to be invited to an enterprise institute, since I don't do enterprise. And then there's the health of our institutions. I just say, Russian experts don't do health. There isn't much to do over there. About a little over 10 years ago, an editor from Harvard University Press dropped by and told me, "I have the book you were born to write." And it's going to be a big one. We made a lot of money on the Piketty book. We're planning on another big one like that. And, well, what is this book? We want you to describe the whole significance of the Russian literary, cultural, and political tradition for the past 200 years. "Oh, is that all?" I said, I said, "Well, I really can't do that because I'm a 19th century specialist, and I'd have to do the Soviet period. I know a little bit. I went to graduate school, but, it's not my field." "Take your time," he said. That's why, the contract was, for 8 years in the future, right? Well, as I thought about this over the years, I decided the best way to do it would be a way that is in the spirit of Russian literature. Russians think of their tradition not as a series of works, but as one whole conversation where basically everyone is speaking to each other at the same time. And that is a literary form which goes back to antiquity, called the Dialogues of the Dead, of which the Russian critic, Mikhail Bakhtin is the great expert on. What happens in the dialogue? Well, in the Dialogues of the Dead, you'll have, philosophers, generals, heroes who live centuries apart in the underworld discussing the ultimate questions, right? But it's not just that they discuss questions that they couldn't discuss if they weren't at the same time. It's that in the underworld, there are no consequences. You don't have to worry about getting in trouble for what you say, the way, I do at Northwestern. There are no consequences in the underworld. And so the questions are all there are. So you can do them with particular intensity. Well, let me take you to a famous passage in the Brothers Karamazov, where Ivan and Alyosha are sitting down to discuss why there is evil in the world, and whether Christianity offers an example, and whether we should want freedom or security. And they begin like this. Ivan says to Alyosha, "What have Russian boys been doing till now? In this stinking tavern, for instance, they meet and they sit down in a corner. They've never met in their lives before, and they won't meet again for 40 years. And what do they talk about in that momentary halt in the tavern? Of the eternal questions, of the existence of God and immortality. And those who do not believe in God talk of socialism or anarchism, of the transformation of humanity on a new pattern, so that it all comes down to the same thing. They're the same questions turned inside out. And masses of the most original Russian boys do nothing but talk of the eternal questions. Isn't that so?" "Yes," says Alyosha, "for real Russians, the questions of God's existence and immortality, or as you say, the same questions turned inside out, come first and foremost, as of course they should," said Alyosha, watching his brother with the same gentle and inquiring smile. "Well, Alyosha," says Ivan, "it's sometimes very unwise to be Russian at all." Well, there are countless such, conversations in Russian literature. They'll meet not necessarily a tavern. Two people will meet in a train carriage, as in Dr. Zhivago, or in what's the equivalent of the first circle of hell in Solzhenitsyn's novel, of that title. And they will, in special circumstances, talk about an ultimate question, or more than one. Well, I decided that should be the model. It's not a historical book. It's a book where the same questions come up over and over again. And so I organized the book by the questions, you see, rather than by historical period. Now, the questions are already asked in Russia where this debate really begins, with the reign of Alexander II, 1855 to 81. That's when you get the nihilists and the revolutionaries first beginning, and the materialists. The great novels of Dostoevsky and Tolstoy all appear then. The questions are defined then, but the Soviet period makes them much more intense. It doesn't really change the questions, but if you want to know what evil is, well, just compare the Gulag with the prison camp Dostoevsky went to, and wrote about in The House of the Dead. And, The House of the Dead, horrifying at the time, looks like a summer resort by comparison. So the questions become much more intense. They go to even more, Russians love extremes, but the conditions now are extreme, not just the tendency to ask extreme questions. But still, it's the closely knit tradition that Russians imagine their works to be. The questions are still there. Well, I set it up by a little oversimplification, by imagining two interlocutors, two arguers disputing. And I relied on a quotation from the philosopher critic Mikhail Gershenson, who wrote in 1909, "The surest gauge of the greatness of a Russian writer is the extent of his hatred for the intelligentsia." Okay. Now, understand, the word intelligentsia in Russian doesn't mean intellectuals. In fact, it almost means the opposite. It means ideologues, okay? Radical ideologues. So nobody would, and a member of intelligentsia, an intelligent, nobody would have considered Leo Tolstoy an intelligent. He wasn't an atheist, he had connections to the social order, he wasn't a revolutionary, that's not what an intelligent was, right? It would be ridiculous. You couldn't be, an intelligent who was a moderate or a conservative. You couldn't be employed by the government. You couldn't have much connection with the social order at all. So the basic criteria would be, first of all, above all, you had to identify as a member of the intelligentsia. Not your social class. That's why Tolstoy, calling himself Count, already, exempted him. Not your social class, not your occupation. There's a revolutionary in one of Dostoevsky's novels who is an engineer, and someone asks, but really, is it wise to employ an engineer who believes in universal destruction? Well, no, is the answer to that one. You had to be a materialist, an atheist, believe in some form of socialism or anarchism, and then you had to live a particular lifestyle, dress in a certain way, ways that this becomes rather familiar. You can imagine the sort of things that, you have, the way you have to dress or think, or, the sexual life you have to live. This became, of course, needless to say, parodied a great deal. You can read a lot of the parodies in Dostoevsky. Well, part of this group took control in 1917. That's who the Bolsheviks were. They were a particularly radical part of the intelligentsia. So the great writers who were arguing with the intelligentsia now had the intelligentsia having state power over them. Right? So that's why, the hostility of one for the other increased. In the 19th century, you see, look, they couldn't get along. The intelligentsia was utopian and believed there were simple solutions to everything, eliminate private property, whatever it was. Great novelists you can't write a great novel if you think the world is simple. People are complicated, right? Society is complicated. The world has contingencies. What's more, literature can't be good if it's just propaganda. That's why there was such hostility to it, right? But in the Soviet period, of course, you got the official writers, but the really great writers who were writing for the drawer, or publishing abroad. Their hostility to now this intelligentsia in power was even greater. And, of course, it was even much more dangerous to publish. Well, so that's one part of the group. You have the writers and the intelligentsia. And here, to appreciate the importance of this, you have to understand how Russians look at literature. It's not, literature has a status in Russia that, so far as I know, has no equivalent anywhere in the world. The purpose of life is literature, okay? We might think, well, literature exists to reflect life. Russians are more likely to think life exists to be made into literature. Look, there's a wonderful passage when Dostoevsky, when he's reviewing Anna Karenina. It was published, in installments in a magazine. He's reviewing one installment, and he says, he's so enthusiastic, he says, at last, the existence of the Russian people has been justified. By a novel? I mean, I can't imagine, a Frenchman thinking they needed to justify it, or an American, but if they did, would they go, what would we go for, the iPhone? Certainly not a novel, right? The only thing I can think of that's comparable is what the status of the Hebrew Bible must have been to the Hebrews when you could still add books to the canon, when the canon was open. Okay? To give you another, we usually think of Stalin as a thug, right? But in fact, he was quite literate. He was also a thug, but he was quite literate, right? There's a wonderful story of Mikhail Sholokhov having trouble publishing a novel, and he writes to Stalin, for help, and to his surprise, Stalin, summons him to the Kremlin a couple of months later, and when he gets there, he sees not just Stalin, but, the editor of the leading newspaper, the head of the army, the head of the economy, they're all been summoned there to hear what Stalin has to say about this novel, which he has read, right? And he goes through a detailed critique of the novel and tells Sholokhov, you can publish it, but you have to change the title. Okay? Now, can one imagine any other world leader, anywhere, ever doing this? Right? I mean, that's how important literature is. Osip Mandelstam, the poet, famously told his wife, I am secure about the status of poetry here, he says, because people get shot for it. Okay? There's nothing like this anywhere else. So to talk about Russian literature is to talk about everything that Russians really, really care about. Well, that's how I begin the book, with that setting it up. The next section of the book deals with what sort of people were engaged, particularly in the 19th century, in these arguments. And I talk about a few types. I didn't invent the types. They're talking about at the time. And you can see them represented, all the, Chekhov's stories, Turgenev's. One is the type I call the wanderer. A wanderer jolts from ideology to ideology. You're convinced absolutely the truth. You've got the absolute truth, and then it fails. So you jump to another one, or convinced that has the absolute truth. The thing is, you're never in doubt. Okay? There's never a moment when you think, maybe we should think more slowly. And you just jump from one ideology to the other. Russia's greatest literary critic, who discovered Dostoevsky and Turgenev and Gogol, really, Vissarion Belinsky, a real genius, was one of these types, jolting from ideology to ideology. And my favorite sentence that he wrote was, if I had the power, it would go ill with someone who thought as I did 6 months ago. Okay, there you have a whole type, right? Chekhov has a wonderful story about this type called On the Road. Another type is, there are types of idealists, and there are two types, and the plots in both in real life and in fiction. One type is, the idealist who finds reality that would refute the simple view that he has, but finds a way to deny it so that he can't be disconfirmed, to stick to his ideal. Dostoevsky refers to this in one sketch as a lie saved by a lie. Okay. The other type, though, recognizes the disappointment and has to deal with it. Okay. This was what typically happened to the Russian populists of the 1870s, who went to the countryside idealizing the people, hoping to spread them to revolt, maybe to educate them, and they found out that these peasants were far from ideal. They were really nauseatingly cruel, sadistic, everything they didn't want them to be, right? And, my favorite of these was a populist writer named Gleb Uspensky. He's not translated, so this is one writer I can't, refer you to, but he was terribly upset, and a lot of his really brilliant sketches are about people like himself discovering that instead of ideal people, there's nothing but, and his favorite word was, swinishness, right? Well, to make a long story short, he went mad and ended his days in an insane asylum convinced he was a pig, that is a swine, okay? This is really, really true. This is, some of them, like, Mussorgsky, drank themselves to death, right? That was a typical fate of, these populist idealists. The third group is the type I call the revolutionist, not the revolutionary. A revolutionist loves revolution for the sake of revolution, okay? And there were a lot of these. I mean, the logic sort of came out to be, you start with, you want to reform society, your goal is social justice, let's say, and revolution is the means. Then, after a while, revolution becomes the goal in itself, and terrorism becomes the mean, and then terrorism becomes the goal in itself, okay? Russia was the first country where terrorism became not just a mass phenomenon, early 20th century, as the chief historian of Russian terrorism has pointed out, there were more terrorist murders than traffic accidents. This is true. It was a recognizable profession that ran in families. Your uncle, your uncle was a terrorist and you want to be an artist? Was common. You have to follow the family tradition. And it was a respected occupation, not just from, men, but women. About a third, believe it or not, of Russian terrorists, including some of the leaders, were women. It was dangerous as a career choice, but it was highly respected. Now, a particularly interesting one, which gives you a sense of what's going on, was a terrorist who was also a novelist, thus combining the two most prestigious occupations in Russia. His name was Boris Savinkov. He was the head of the combat organization of the Socialist Revolutionary Organization for a while and did other terrorist activities. But it was clear he didn't care who he committed terrorist acts for. He would join with anybody. The point was, we're all terrorists. Let's do it. Okay? He just loved. Now, in his novels, by the way, he kept the two occupations were simultaneous. He started from the beginning, pretty much at the same time, and he kept clippings of his activity, the reviews of his books and of his revolutionary activities, and the novels are about terrorism, as you can. And it isn't clear to me, after reading these novels, and his memoirs and accounts of his life, whether he wrote novels to celebrate his activities as a terrorist, or whether he became a terrorist to have material for his novels. It really isn't clear. This is Russia we're talking about. Okay? Now, most of the book, though, is the big questions. That's, the second half of the book. And I'll just outline to you roughly what these, questions are. And I set it up with, people from different periods arguing these questions. The first one is, what is the proper role of theory in life? Mikhail Bakhtin referred to a particular type of thinking he didn't like as theoretism, which is the theory is more important than the reality. Right? In response, you get a lot of Russian thinkers. Tolstoy is the one that comes to mind immediately, thinking that what we need, let's say if I want to use philosophical terms, it's not what Aristotle called theoretical wisdom, but phronesis, practical wisdom. And ethics is not a matter of deductive theory from, but of the wisdom you acquire case by case, casuistry as it was once called, right? And novels are the best place to teach this because they give you particularly dense appreciations of cases, right? That don't fit theories, okay? So the theory in question is one. The next is what I call, is what is not to be done. The most influential Russian novel of the time was a revolutionary novel called What Is to Be Done. This is about materialism and ethics. And, the Dostoevsky characters who say, if there is no God, all is permitted, right? Where do you get morality from if it's a world that has nothing but material law? If I drop a coin and it falls at 9.8 meters per second squared, is that moral or immoral? Well, the question makes no sense, but if that's all there is, then if all we are complex beings reducible to natural laws, then no moral question makes any sense. Things are as they are, right? If you really want to take this to its extreme, and these are Russian, so they do, okay? You get Lenin's conclusion from this, okay? Let me see if I can try it this way. When I started working on Lenin, I thought a fair paraphrase of his belief would be, listen, if you need to kill people, you just do it. That is not a fair paraphrase of his belief, I discovered. It might be a fair paraphrase of Kropotkin, the anarchist belief, but not Lenin's, because it suggests that you only kill people if you need to. Anyone who thinks that way, from Lenin argued, Trotsky is the same way, anyone who thinks that way believes that in something like the sanctity of human life. But where do you get the sanctity of human life from if you don't believe in God? It's fundamentally a religious view you have to reject, right? And so, those who reproach us with cruelty do not understand the fundamentals of Marxism, he said, right? I thought of that line when somebody recently said, what did you think decolonization meant about Hamas, right? What do you think it meant? So people who wanted to please him, go out and kill all these people, they would ask, and under Stalin too, they would ask to kill more. If you were reluctant to kill somebody, it showed you were covertly religious. So you always had to ante it up, right? Now, historians have had a few things that they couldn't really resolve about the Stalinist period, but this approach helped me, I think, come up with the solution. Their problem is this. There's something, as one of the historians says, truly preposterous about Soviet policy. What sense does it make to spend years training people to be, let's say, scientists, and then arrest them for things that they haven't done, hire a whole series of investigators, to spend weeks torturing them to get them to confess to something that nobody believes, right? And then take them and send them out, in boxcars to Siberia, these cars, railroad cars, which will be unheated in summer, frozen in winter. The people would be given, salted herring, no water to eat. Some cars would arrive, in Siberia with everybody dead already. The ones who didn't would get shipped up to the frozen north. And then you have these scientists, digging, in the frozen earth. What sense does this make? If you want to get rid of him, just shoot him, right? What sense does this make, right? And then what sense does it spend all this effort to train scientists and then not use them, right? So models that try to explain this by, there must have been economic efficiency to slave labor, as Anne Applebaum's book does. I think that's absolutely ridiculous. That clearly can't. The historians who think this is preposterous are closer to the. But the reason is, you do this. You see, I think it's the wrong question, because it presumes that you would not do this unless there was a reason. But under Stalin and the Soviet period, cruelty is the default position. You need a reason not to do that. Once you get that as the principle, and how it flows from Leninist, ethics, then this really becomes clear, right? Another question is, I call it "Who is not to blame?" There was a novel called "Who is to Blame?" And it's the ways in which people who do terrible things try to avoid moral responsibility for them. Bakhtin called it having an alibi, okay? Not I, but the party is doing it. My favorite example is, in one of Solzhenitsyn's novels, one of the characters asks another, talking about the starvation of millions of peasants and the collectivization, how terrible it is. And, her Orthodox Bolshevik boyfriend replies, "But who is doing these things? It's history," with a capital H. And it took me a while to really appreciate how important it was that history is not just the series of events you write down, but is an agent itself, right? And then things happen because they are history, and then you don't have any responsibility. There are a whole lot of ways in which in 1927 people explores. Anna Karenina is about a different way of, in which the heroine avoids responsibility for her, the way she hurts people. Self-deception is a big part of it. There are many ways, and these are really profound, both in the 19th and 20th century. And they teach us a lot about how we all do this, right? I call the next chapter, "What Time Is It?" And it's roughly do you think of the world deterministically? And if you're thinking of history, is there a single path to history? Does Russia, for example, have to follow in the path of the West, the way Marx thought, right? The way liberal historians have thought, or are there the real alternatives? Are things not pre-given? The way I like to phrase this is, are there more, for a determinist, the number of actualities and possibilities are the same. Whatever could happen does happen. Whatever doesn't happen couldn't happen. But maybe if you believe in open time, as let's say Dostoevsky did, then you believe that there are more possibilities than actualities, that something else could have happened. That if you played the tape over again, you could get a different result from the same circumstances. Russians really think hard about the nature of time in this way. And I found that a particularly interesting argument. Another question would be, I call it, what don't we appreciate? And it's a question that goes right from the beginning on, which is, from 1855. Are the most important events in life the big, dramatic ones, in your own life, the most memorable ones? Or is life really made up of the sum total of very small actions? And the big ones are the consequence of what happens to those small ones, right? Tolstoy has this wonderful essay, essay about why you shouldn't drink or smoke, right? And he starts with, this rather uninteresting premise, but then in a typical way, he justifies it in a brilliant way, right? He quotes a story about the painter Brulov, who once corrected a student's sketch. And the student said, "Why, you've only touched it a tiny bit, but it's quite a different thing." Brulov replied, "Art begins where that tiny bit begins." And Tolstoy says, that saying is strikingly true, not only of art, but of all of life. True life begins where infinitesimally small changes occur, right? The time when Raskolnikov lived his true life and decided to kill the old woman was not when he was thinking about theory. It's when he was lying on his sofa thinking about nothing in particular. But in his consciousness, tiny alterations were taking place. Now, the same could be said. War and Peace argues this for history, right? It's the sum total of small events. Chekhov, this is Chekhov's key idea. We think the world is, we misunderstand the world if we think it's about dramatic action. So he produces dramas which should have drama without drama, okay? And anyone who thinks that it should have drama is histrionic and absurd, like, Uncle Vanya. The famous comment of a critic, the only thing that happens in Chekhov's play, The Three Sisters, is that three sisters do not go to Moscow. And that's actually a pretty good description of the play. In our time, Svetlana Alexievich has made this the center of her art. In her wonderful book on, women's war, we have all these myths about World War II. She goes to talk to women who have never even articulated their own experience. She gets them to do it. They're surprised at themselves what they say, because they all buy into the official myth. And she finds a whole aspect of life that has never been recorded, that women experience and women can express. And it's these prosaic things, right? This approach, right, which I like to call prosaics, she's following on Tolstoy and Chekhov, when thinking of it this way. And then I give a chapter to what doesn't it all mean? What is the meaning of life? I mean, it wouldn't be Russian literature, you wouldn't have a chapter on that, right? And, War and Peace, Prince Andrei keeps discovering what the meaning of life isn't. You read Chekhov's stories, like one called Happiness. One thing is clear is that the meaning of life is not individual happiness. If that's all you can think of, you're living a really shallow life, okay? But what is it? Well, that's really, the question that goes from Tolstoy to Solzhenitsyn to Grossman, and the characters who go through extreme situations, through the gulag, right? Like Solzhenitsyn himself, discover things about what's important in life they would never have discovered before. Solzhenitsyn discovers God also, right? And Solzhenitsyn will wind up saying at one point, having made such a discovery, "Bless you, prison, for having been in my life." Not in the extreme situation, he wouldn't have made it. My conclusion, which Chris was alluding to, I call it Into the World Symposium, and it takes off from a paragraph I love in Bakhtin in his notebooks, and it goes like this. The dialogic nature of human consciousness, the dialogic nature of human life itself, the single adequate form for verbally expressing authentic human life is the open-ended dialogue. To live means to participate in dialogue. In this dialogue, a person participates throughout his life with his eyes, lips, hands, soul, spirit, whole body, and deeds. He invests his entire life in discourse, and this discourse enters into the dialogic fabric of human life, into the world symposium. Okay? Dialogue, in this sense, is not just an exchange. Each person changes by truly listening to the other, and they each wind up with truth they wouldn't have had otherwise, right? That's the opposite of dogmatic catechism, right? In dialogue, right? And truth, he thinks, is and can only be arrived at by this process. This, of course, is the opposite of those who are too certain. They have the ideology. It's about wonder versus certainty, okay, which is the two different worldviews here. I say at the end of this study as a hero, it's Chekhov because he was the most unideological of all the Russian writers. Even Tolstoy at the end of his life thinks he's found some absolute truth. Dostoevsky knows too. The only one who's completely immune to this is the perfect skeptic always. Not nihilist, but skeptic is Chekhov. And I'll just close by a quotation I love from, I hope you will read it someday, The Master and Margarita, which I think is the great 20th century Russian novel. In it tells the story of Jesus and Pontius Pilate in one story, and then an outer tale which takes place in Soviet Russia, where the devil comes to shake up all these people who are too sure of themselves, But in the story of Jesus and Pontius Pilate, it winds up at the end of the novel, Pilate has been punished for 2,000 years, but he's finally going to be released. And he continues, what he most wants to do is continue his conversation with the vagrant philosophers he wants with Jesus, right? And he has a dream. He set out on a shining road, accompanied by his loyal dog, Banga, and alongside him was the vagrant philosopher, Jesus. They were arguing about something complex and important, and neither one of them could convince the other. They did not agree on anything, and that made their dispute all the more engaging and endless. Rightly conducted, the conversation about ultimate questions remains engaging and endless. Let us keep the conversation going. Thank you.
Thank you for your wonderful remarks, Professor Morson.
Thanks for having me.
One question that one might want to start by asking you is not just why to write this book, but why, as a reader, we should read it. Why should we care about Russian literature today? But you've already done a service by showing us why we should care in your remarks. But there's another reason why I think it's an inappropriate question to ask you in particular, which is that something that your admirers will probably know about you, certainly your students and former students know, which is that your course at Northwestern, the Introduction to Russian Literature, is, if I'm correct about this, the best attended humanities course at Northwestern. When I was there, it was certainly, it was taught in a auditorium in the tech building, which is the big engineering building. 600 seats, the room is filled. It's one of the most talked about classes among undergraduates. And this part maybe will embarrass you a little bit. When I was at Northwestern, at least, at the end of a course, if the students liked the class, they would applaud for the professor after the last lecture. And that always happened in your classes. But in addition to that, you would also receive standing ovations from the students. It was like the end of a rock concert. It was incredible. So the question I think
You see why I haven't retired.
the question that I would want to ask is what's going on at Northwestern? What is it that the students there are seeing in your class and in the subject matter? What could we learn from them? As this certainly seems countercultural in a very important way.
Well, I hope so.
Use your microphone.
Oh, thank you. Is it on?
No, I think you're actually sitting on.
Oh. I'd much rather have it in my hand. I don't really have the answer, to that, but I've speculated on it. And, in the Russian department, when we teach literature, we teach literature. We don't teach, politics, deconstruction, abstract theory applied to literature. We teach great literature. We don't we haven't decided that, value is entirely, relative to your social need. It's hard to imagine any Russian thinking that, since literature is so important, right? But, we keep to the spirit of Russian literature. And what do students go to college for? They go to ask big questions. The only time they're ever going to get a chance to, and they know this, right? So they wind up in this class because, they don't get it in their English and French classes, right? They get in a few philosophy classes, and they go to those. But this is the only place they really get it. So I think that's why, where they come and they're responding to the spirit of Russian literature, and that's what I try to convey. I try to do it in the spirit of Russian literature. I have this method of teaching I call impersonation, which is I never tell students what I think about any issue that comes up. I impersonate, let's say, what Dostoevsky would say. Let's say if it's an issue we didn't discuss but is around now, how would materialism be expressed now? Okay, well, what would Dostoevsky about contemporary version? Or perhaps what a character in his novels, they're all ideological, would say. But I never tell them what I think, okay? I impersonate the author to give them a sense of what it is to think like that. That's much more important for them than knowing what I think. I mean, I'm not Dostoevsky, right? And it always amazes me that, you get, I don't know, an assistant professor of English giving his political views and shaking his finger against Milton and Shakespeare, and saying, you didn't recycle. I just wonder why people just don't get up. This assistant telling, why don't they just laugh? But, the sense of that would be absurd. It's kind of, restrains me. And then they get what it feels like to be, a Tolstoy character, to look at the world like Prince Andrei. And that tells them something that makes it, since this is a novel, it shows you what it is. Philosophy courses will analyze the idea, strengths and weaknesses, but the great novels tells you what it feels like to actually find it convincing, to live it. That you don't get anywhere but in great novels, all right? And so that's what I try to convey, in what they feel.
Something else that you do is impersonate the characters and read aloud from the novels. And I think all of your students and former students will probably particularly remember your Fyodor Pavlovich impersonation from The Brothers Karamazov. I want to ask you
He's
a little...
so evil, it's fun.
So staying on this just for a little while longer, I want to ask you a bit more about your approach to teaching and writing Russian literature. Something about your approach strikes me, using the same word again, as quite countercultural, but in almost two opposing ways. So if there's a conventional view about 19th century, old literature today, it might be that it's a waste of time. It's useless. Why would we waste our time doing that when we could be doing something practical? An opposing view might be, no, it's quite useful. It's an instrument for social critique or for political critique, or maybe it equips us with critical thinking skills that we need to go on in our professional lives. But your approach seems to be sort of neither nor and both and at the same time, which is to say, the practical lessons that we can glean from reading Russian literature really comes through. And at the same time, it's clear that these texts are not to be treated as mere instruments for something else. And I wonder if you could talk about that. It almost seems like an embodiment of that relationship between theory and practice that you raise as one of the big questions in your book.
If by practical you mean something of immediate use, now I know how to do this, a particular skill you can apply. I think it's really hopeless to defend great literature that way. I mean, there are lots of better ways to get particular skills than that. Plumbing, for instance, right? I mean, what does literature do that, particularly great novels, which I specialize in, what does it do that you can't get anywhere else? And my answer to that will be something that people pay lip service to now, but don't actually do, which is empathize with someone unlike yourself. See the world from the perspective of someone different. When you identify, with Anna Karenina, right, a person of a different gender, century, social class, upbringing, and live with her or him for 800 pages, tracing her thoughts from within, because that's what novels do. They give you the internal consciousness, the thing we can't get in life. We must infer internal states, but novelists actually give you them, right? By tracing the inner dialogue of the character, right? You empathize with someone unlike yourself. History class, philosophy class can tell you to empathize, but they don't give you practice in it. But you can hardly avoid it, reading a great novel. And then you come out wiser in that way. You have practice, and hopefully you can apply it elsewhere. The moral lesson of novels is not primarily, some conclusion that an author draws. It's that. It's the wisdom you get from understanding the world, getting outside yourself and understanding the world from other perspectives that you would not do it. And not just understanding it abstractly, but feeling it, you see?
One way to think about your book is as an impassioned plea for complexity, for nuance, open-mindedness, driving this from the tradition of great Russian literature, and as opposed to, a worldview that rejects these things, right? Ideological closure, certainty, moral superiority, infallibility. The question I want to ask is, how, as a reader, can we cultivate those virtues today? These sort of seem like
Russian literature.
Well, this was my question. Is it through reading Russian literature? You also mentioned in your closing the importance of dialogue. At a time when so many cultural, political forces seem to be militating against doing precisely that, what is it that we can do to cultivate those habits?
Well, that's one of the thoughts I've had about, is a lot of emphasis has been placed on the violations of free speech. And it's important to preserve free speech, but that's not enough. I mean, if all free speech is on campus is two people freely shouting at each other, okay, you've got free speech, but surely education can do better than that. What colleges should be cultivating is a spirit of civil dialogue where people actually listen to each other, enter into each other's perspective, right? That's much more than free speech. Having a real conversation, right? That's what, colleges be look like. Then you don't come in with it, well, I've got the absolute truth and I'm going to shout it. And okay, if I have to, I'll let you shout your absolute truth. Listen, it's better than not shouting anything and being suppressed, but it's not what colleges should be doing, right? And rather, my students recognize moments, let's say, in Russian literature that are very much like what's happening now. Like, one of Dostoevsky's favorite themes is cultivated victimology, okay? Which, of course, is everywhere. So that, Fyodor Pavlovich Karamazov, who you mentioned, says at one point, he says, it's very pleasant to take offense, isn't it? Okay? In fact, it's not only pleasant, it's positively distinguished to take offense. Now, I don't have to gloss that very hard, okay, for them. They know it, the feeling of moral superiority of, how dare you, right? It's there. But what I can do is then say, and what is the psychological mechanism that makes that pleasant? And then how Dostoevsky shows that, right? So that also shows the weakness of being too full of yourself and not listening to somebody else, right? I mean, the students profess to believe in empathy, so you can play on that to get them actually to do it.
I wasn't going to ask you about this, but your remarks reminded me of it. And your book is dedicated to Morton Shapiro, the former president of Northwestern. I wonder if you could say a little bit about your work with him and co-teaching a class with him on this issue of open-mindedness and its importance in higher education.
Well, it wasn't on that issue, but the issue came up. Morty is an economist, right? And we taught this class together for 11 years. It changed over the 11 years. It's what does what he do and I do have in common? Well, we're both interested in how people make choices. That's what economics is, right? But we're also interested in how different disciplines don't just have different subject matter, but they view the world differently. They cut up the world. They ask different questions. Different things count as evidence. So we set up this class to disagree, about the economic model of human behavior. I mean, to anyone who's read Dostoevsky, the idea that people always behave rationally seems ludicrous, right? I'm speaking my perspective, right? We have a lot of readings to bring, but the point is we disagree, about this. And when students had to write papers, we never told them what was the right answer. They got to see actual civil disagreement, impassioned but civil, right? And when we gave them papers to write, we'd give them a topic, but they could take either side of the issue, and they were going to be graded by how strong the argument they argued against was presented, right? As we like to say, you don't get any credit for being a prize fighter beating up a kindergartner, okay? You get a much better grade if you argue against a really strong opposing view. Then you realize why people would believe it, you say. And so we didn't talk about any, really hot-button issues of the day, because we were pretty sure students would just close, they couldn't deal with it. But we taught them how to have civil disagreement by talking about, issues which they, listen, they take an economics class, they have a strong belief in economic model or not, right? But ones they can still listen to counter arguments to and then, absorb. So we did that, changing the reading, developing it over 11 years until finally Morty stepped down as president and moved to California, so we haven't done it since. But I'm actually cultivating another similar class with a professor who's a psychologist who's an expert on how to understand life in terms of narrative. He's a real genius on this, so maybe something else will come out of that. We'll disagree, too.
So getting into the substance of the book a bit more, and I want to make sure we also have time for audience questions in a few minutes here. One of the things that always strikes me as a reader of Russian literature, I'm sure others have this experience, is that on the one hand, the world depicted in Tolstoy or Dostoevsky seems very alien, right? What could be more remote from 21st century American experience than 19th century Russian aristocratic life or something? On the other hand, there are aspects of it that are not even timeless, but really amazingly timely, or seem to be speaking directly to the present. And there are a number of themes in your book that have that characteristic too. You mentioned some of them in your remarks, but I was hoping you could say a bit more about them here. 3 come to mind. So populism, the intelligentsia, and terrorism, right? So these are 3 ideas, concepts, which, if I understand, we owe to Russian culture.
The term populism is actually a Russian coinage,
But
as is the term intelligentsia, right?
And much of your discussion of them and your remarks earlier emphasize, how untranslatable the concept, say, of the intelligentsia is. And on the other hand, when reading your book, the resonances to today sort of jump out of the page. And I'm wondering how to think about the contemporary relevance, not just of these terms, but of these in particular, while respecting their historical, cultural particularity.
Well, most of the reviews of the book has been very positive, but there were a few that were not. And one I particularly was interested in is one that said, well, why doesn't he draw specific conclusions? Why doesn't he talk about President Putin? Why doesn't he talk about something that's happening today in America? And, my reply is, if you do that, then the book dates in 5 years. At my age, I don't want to write a book that dates in 5 years. I want it to be there, then people born today are as old as I am now, will still look at it. So I avoided, I have a lot of articles that sometimes are like that too. Like, I did one a number of years ago for First Things on what I call the suicide of the Russian liberals, why they wound up losing, right? And basically committing suicide. I mean, they supported, the revolutionaries, and those are the first people Lenin shot. How does this happen? What's the mindset? Well, I didn't draw any conclusions about American liberals now, but nobody missed them. I mean, in fact, First Things insisted on giving it a title, Suicide of the Liberals. I call it Suicide of the Russian Liberals. All right. But I wasn't going to draw. But yet, the conclusions are all the more powerful if you don't draw them explicitly, right? If you draw the conclusion, somebody will say, I don't know, it doesn't exactly apply. And they'll be thinking counter-arguments. But if you keep it implicit, they'll say, wait a minute, I can apply that to... It works much better that way, right? Also, it gives me a little protection to get Northwestern.
The particularly sort of chilling resonance that you emphasize, you don't emphasize the resonance, but a characteristic that you discuss in the book is the capacity for the most cultivated and educated in society to condone or even participate in the most cruel forms of violence.
Well, not just condone. I mean, it's intellectuals who are the most likely to be the cruelest. Whether we're talking about the Third Reich or the Soviet period, and they provide the intellectual justification for others. There's a passage I really love in the Gulag Archipelago where he asks, look, if you read Shakespeare's plays, right? Macbeth killed a few people, Iago kills a few people, right? But Stalin killed millions. Lenin and Stalin killed millions. What's the difference? And the answer is, he gives, Macbeth had no ideology. He didn't have an intellectual philosophical system. Nobody likes to think of themselves as cruel and evil. it's not like Spider-Man, where there's somebody up there saying, oh, I love evil, rubbing his hands together, right? People always want to think that they're doing good, no matter what they're doing. And ideology is what allows someone to think they're doing good while starving peasants to death, right? And so it's the intelligentsia. I'm just reading this book called The Nazi Conscience, about the intellectuals in the Nazi regime, and how they, provided a kind of justification that ordinary people could buy, who wouldn't have bought it, 6 years earlier. The intelligentsia has, a lot to answer for now at time.
Well, I want to make sure that we have time for audience questions. I could keep asking you questions all day, so if there are any questions. Yes.
I think you've answered a big question. It seems in the literature tradition, you're saying that Ukraine nor Russia would have any history for respecting what their borders were. That would be like a false construct.
Say that again, I'm sorry.
The fighting in Ukraine, having an issue be the border. The literary tradition seems like you're saying unanimously it would be a false construct to have respected a border just because it was drawn that way. There would be passions that would lead to the border. Is there a literary tradition that would respect a border as it was just drawn and supposedly to be recognized by the world community? Or is it the tradition that for both Ukraine and Russia that borders would be flexible?
I mean, you're asking a wonderful question. You really asked the question, it's the topic of the book I'm writing now, not this one. I think of it, the Russian quest for Russianness, right? To understand what's going on, you need to understand how Russians think about war, about borders, about their history, and it's very much unlike what we think of, right? And that's why we have so much trouble, understanding it. I mean, I did one article a while ago where, at the very beginning of the war, where I said, we will get tired of paying for this war before they get tired of dying in it. Okay? War means something to them. Listen, if you ask an American, what makes you an American? I don't know anybody who would say, it's war. It's our attitude to war. Almost every Russian would answer that way, right? I mean, what's the big holiday in Russia? It's May 9th when they defeated the Nazis. I mean, there's a mythology, They still celebrate as a major holiday the day in 1612 when they beat the Poles. The folklore. War is essential there. And so if you don't get that, why do Russians win wars even when they have less technology? How do they beat Germans and Napoleon? It's because they have stoikos, steadfastness, I get it, right? They will endure anything, and then you will get tired. So that's why they don't worry that they've lost, 390,000 casualties. It doesn't matter. That's how Russians win. And when they conquer Ukraine, they'll just draft all those people until they'll make up for it. And if they don't, well, that's what Russians do. I mean, this is very different, right? And one of the reasons we have so much trouble, I think Americans have so much trouble in negotiating with the rest of the world, is that we assume that everybody is like us. Well, they all want to be democratic, don't they? They all want a good standard of living as the highest goal of life. What else could they want but individual happiness? I don't think Islamists think that way, right? And certainly Russians don't think that way. And, but that's the topic of another book that I'm actually writing right now.
Are the Ukrainians Russians in that perspective of the tradition?
Well, all the Ukrainians, listen, they were all educated in the Soviet Union, right? I mean, so how do you figure that the Ukrainians are resisting the way they are? They've got the same mentality, right? But they're also just as corrupt in their government for the same reasons, right? I mean,
Other questions? Yes, right here.
Speaking about It's a Georgian American. You speak about Russians as if this is really only one entity, and assuming that they really are one, how do you then deal, and that they have the same understanding of the war and traditions and values, how do you explain the presence of another Russian like Vladimir Karamurza, who sees the war so differently and is in prison and is calling for change and for different kind of Russia to appear on the map of the world? So how do you explain that?
Oh, yes. I mean, look, they're not all the same. I was talking about the predominant view. But one of the reasons, you can ask the question, why will these greatest defense of the individual take place in the writers in the Soviet Union, like Grossman and Solzhenitsyn? And the answer is precisely for that reason. When you have an extreme of one perspective and you see its shortcoming, you're going to have people generate the other. That's why it's Russians who think of, like Tolstoy and Chekhov, who think of the importance of the small events in life in a country where everything is supposed to be, big events, right? It's the response. The extreme of one gives you the response in the other. But of course, not everybody's the same. I mean, right now you've got, how many Russians have left the country? What is it, 1 million Russians since the war? By the way, that's how you know that Russia's a lot better now than it was in Soviet days, because you couldn't leave in Soviet days, right? It's a lot, I know it's a lot freer than it used to be for the time being, right? And many of them leave, and they're not just leaving to save their skin. I mean, a lot of them, they just don't think that way. But most of them made the effort to get news from other sources as you can, let's say in the big cities. And this is what really strikes me, Russians who want to get uncensored news that disagrees with official positions, they take risks and a lot of effort, and even more in the Soviet period. That's what makes me, so amazed at Americans who silo themselves and have never heard a point of view that their neighbors do. I mean, they easily could, and their ignorance is willed, is chosen. So the contrast there, with the Russians who actually take a risk, or Poles who took a risk in Soviet days, really strikes me as, it means I actually have very little sympathy for the Americans who silo themselves.
Time for a couple more questions. Yes, over here.
Thank you. Chen Shah, I'm with Voice of America. Thanks for being here today.
I'm sorry, could you talk louder?
Sure. My name's Chen Shah. I'm here with Voice of America. Thanks for being here today. You raised the point of Joseph Stalin, who is the great counterexample to the idea that literature can be a civilizing force, because he read a lot and it doesn't seem to have done him much good. The wonder-certainty ratio very off with him. So I'm wondering, is that character type, the kind of sensitive but heartless person, the person who can recognize humanity on the page but not in real life, does it exist in Russian literature? Can we understand him and people like him through the books that they were reading?
Do you get literate ideologues in Russian literature? Yeah, you do. I mean, ideologue is almost the default position of characters in Russian literature, right? But the fact that literature has the ability to teach empathy doesn't mean that's how you have to use it, right? You can use medical knowledge to spread disease. I mean, you don't have to use it in one way, right? Anything that can be used can be abused, right? So there's no guarantee that literature will do this, but it has a unique potential, and that's why I don't know. Characters, let's say in Grossman's novel, see it as the one hope that things can change, that things can be really different. But of course, it doesn't have to.
I think we have time for one more question. But
Could you talk a bit about
how science is portrayed in the Russian literary tradition that you're speaking about, because it strikes me when I think about wonder and certainty, science can be both a source of wonder and curiosity and amazement, and also a driver of ideology, the intelligentsia, sort of the scientific view of history where there's no margin. You talk about that difference between possibility and actuality. Yeah, so curious to hear more about that.
Well, I should begin by saying that before I studied literature, I was going to be a physicist. And I still love science. You know, I follow it, I read it. But what your science is, by its nature, open-minded. Every statement has to be open, experimental, you know, in principle, to being reproduced in a way that might refute it, right? But that isn't necessarily the attitude of people who, quote, believe in science. I love these long signs that say, we believe in science. Or we believe science. You don't believe in science. What, you believe in the Pythagorean theorem? Come on. To say you believe in science means you don't get what it is. Okay? It's not a matter of belief. It's not a matter of authority. I mean, my favorite statement of the worst understanding of science of the last 10 years is Dr. Fauci's, if you question me, you're questioning science. Science has nothing to do with personal authority. It counts for nothing, right? Right? You know. What you're talking about is a worldview that many scientists have, that many people who study scientists have. That's, you know, you get that, that's Ivan Karamazov starts with that worldview, right? Which says, well, you know, since we have found a lot of deterministic laws, that proves that the universe is deterministic. Now think for a moment. Isn't that rather a leap? You know, I found 10 white sheep, all sheep are white. I mean, this doesn't apply at all. If it's to be a scientific statement, there has to be the possibility of falsifying it. How would you, what would you do to prove either determinism or indeterminism? You can't set up a controlled experiment with the whole universe. It's perfectly obvious that neither one can be proven or disproven, and therefore neither one is a scientific statement, okay? It's what I find kind of convincing. That's not science. I mean, you can argue for it, but as a philosopher, but it's not science. And a great deal of what's presented. Now, if you now talk about the so-called science of history or economics, look, ever since the 17th century, when Newton reduced the amazingly complicated motions of the planets to 4 simple laws, one thinker after another has assumed we should be able to do the same thing for human and social affairs. And you come up with one pseudoscience after another, you know. I won't list it. Freud, Marx, behaviorism. Now we have Jared Diamond's, you know, reduce it all. There's dozens of them. After you could do the whole history of Western thoughts and say there's one pseudoscience after the other. This is what I attacked Morty for, you know, his belief that economics was a science, right? You know, I asked him for, you know, in the 80s, I was a fellow at the Center for the Behavioral Sciences, where they really believed in you know, economics was a hard science. And we all had to give a talk, and I gave a talk on why I didn't think so. And I got a question from this guy whose name I won't forget because it was Henry Aaron, but he was not a baseball player. He was the head of the Brookings Institution at the time. And he said, he quoted to me, well, you know, even if it's not plausible that people always behave rationally, Milton Friedman, in his essay of 1955, Positive Economics, said that it doesn't matter whether the model is plausible itself, it only matters whether it yields good predictions. My answer was, well, Henry, between us, how good are economists' predictions? And he thought for a moment, and he said, you have a point, and he sat down. It's certainly not a science. I mean, you know, my lifetime has been, you can't have, you know, inflation and high unemployment, and then we had stagflation, right? each time, and then they come to a theory to explain how it happened. They always have a theory to explain what did happen that they didn't predict. But that's not, you don't test something, but astrologists can do that. You have to be able to predict, and there's not much of a track record. There's better in microeconomics than macro, but
Well, at the risk of irking Mike Strain, my economist colleague, I think that has to be the note we're going to end on as we're out of time. But thank you, Professor Morson.